Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Allison Stanger, and I'm director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College and a professor of political science. I'd like to begin by thanking the Program in Environmental Studies, the Office of Environmental Affairs, the Career Services Office, and Brainerd Commons for making today's event possible. This lecture, as many of you know, is part of our ongoing series in corporate social responsibility, which is a collaboration between international studies or international affairs and environmental affairs / environmental studies, and it's been a rich program, and I have no doubt that this lecture will not break with that tradition. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Christian Thommessen to Middlebury College. Christian hails from Norway, but his father actually attended Middlebury College, where I believe he was a member of the Nordic ski team.
I think so.
So in some sense, he's coming home, even though is this your first visit?
It is
here?
Indeed.
Even though this is his first visit here, he has experienced Middlebury through his father's imagination and stories. So welcome
Thank
home. Christian has a really interesting career. He's moved effortlessly between business and public service. He is the founder of the United Nations Development Program's Growing Inclusive Markets Initiative, and I've asked him to speak on that topic today. The title of his talk, as you can see, is Creating Values for All, Strategies for Doing Business with the Poor. So please join me in welcoming Christian Thommessen back to his father's old stomping grounds.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and in fact, I spent the day here around the campus. That was quite interesting. I have tons of kids like you, myself, and they are, one of them is in Milano, and another one at Berkeley. And I spent, as a 51-year-old, I had to spend a lot of time thinking through life when I spent the whole day here today. So my day has already been saved, in fact, and hopefully I can help your day a little bit by delivering some thoughts on business and development. I don't know what you guys know about UNDP. UNDP is what we call in the development world the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That means on behalf of the UN system, UNDP owns 3 huge mandates. Poverty reduction, climate change together with UNEP in Nairobi, and democratic governance of nations. Now, as you can imagine, each one of those mandates is a mouthful. And the question is, what does the private sector has to do with poverty reduction, climate change, and democratic governance? Now, I'll save you the politics of the UN only by telling you that my role at the UN has been to build a private sector division and an initiative, which I'll share with you some thoughts about, which are all related to democratic governance, climate change, and poverty reduction. And what I would like to share with you today is half an hour's discussion on the role of the private sector in development. And I was a little bit flabbergasted when I heard that this little speech is a part of a CSR series that you have here at the school, because let me right away tell you that I'm going to shoot down the notion of CSR, or in fact, hopefully bring this notion a little step further ahead, but let's come back to that. Now, from a development, I'm a businessman by origin. I have a long career with IBM and McKinsey & Company and a number of other American and international companies, but when I finally grew up, I decided that public service was probably even more rewarding and more important than making money or developing a company. But the truth is that if you take the development lens or the world lens on today, now over the last year, particularly in the US, times doesn't look as good as they did, but the truth is over the last 10 years, the world generally has seen a growth pattern which is unprecedented in historic terms. In Africa, more than 20 nations have been growing more than 5% their GDP during the first decade of this millennium. And one would expect, as you have felt, I'm sure, in your homes, at least before the last year, that times have really become better. Life has improved for most people. So it might shock you, and some of you of course know this, that despite the fact that the world has been growing at a tremendous rate, there is a huge proportion of the world population, in fact 2.6 billion people, 40% of the population, who are excluded from participation in this growth. And the problem from a human development perspective is that the differences, despite this huge growth, the differences are increasing. Differences between nations in terms of growth and wealth, and more importantly, differences within nations, also within the United States, by the way. There is a huge problem of the gap increasing. So we have, as a globe, we have a challenge in, how do we include more people than we have been able to include in this growth pattern. And that's, of course, the UN's perspective and the development society's perspective on growth. We are not interested in people getting rich or private enterprise per se, but we are interested in any vehicle that can include more people than today in participating in growth. And that's where the role of the private sector comes in, and it is a very important role, in fact. And before I dive into my speech, I will start with an anecdotal story which really explains my whole presentation. Because what we found at UNDP, together with a huge coalition, which you can look up at our website, of academics in the north and the south, businesses in the north and the south, we discovered a myriad of unbelievable stories where enterprises who worked inclusive, and I'll explain to you what I mean by working inclusive, they were able to do good and do well at the same time. Do well for their company, making growth, creating a market share and making a profit, and include the poor on the other side of the equation at the same time. So my speech really is all about a woman called Nancy. And I have many, many stories which I will not have the time to share with you over in the next 40 minutes, but I'll start this whole pitch by sharing with you one of the most wonderful stories I know about in the context that we're now discussing. The role of private sector in development. Now, if you go back 40 years in time, let's talk about the 70s. You are in Mauritania. Do you know anything about Mauritania? Mauritania is a desert country in sub-Saharan Africa, in the middle of Western Middle Africa. It had at the time 3 million inhabitants. All of these people were nomadic herders, people with their camel herds, which you've seen on the TV, and probably maybe some of you know them. 3 million people lived like that, had a free life, Bedouins, free life. But in the late 70s, there was a huge drought in sub-Saharan Africa. And unfortunately, 1/3 of these herders had to leave their herds and become poor people in the capital of Mauritania called Nouakchott. So in the 80s, this country had 2 million herders living their independent life in the desert, and 1 million former herders who were hopelessly lost in poverty because of total lack of infrastructure. This is a very poor country. And the irony of all of this is that while the herders in Mauritania were self-sustained, that is the key pride, the key sign of pride and sustainability, that you can survive your herd, you can live independently of your herd. So you had 2 million people who did it traditionally, but the 1 million who no longer had a herd, they had to force their country to import dairy products from Europe in order to survive. And that was a direct negative impact on this small country's trade balance. Very sad story. Now in this environment, our little hero, whose name is Nancy Abaidrahmane, who's now a 60-year-old lady, she decided to set up the West Africa's first dairy business in Mauritania. This is 1987. Imagine the barriers that this woman had to overcome in order to set up a successful business. Let's take them one by one. Point one, if you want to set up a dairy business, you are dependent on suppliers, right? Somebody needed to supply you camel milk and camel cheese and other things, right? Now, unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a huge tradition, as I already mentioned to you, that you want to be self-sustainable. You want to have a herd big enough for your flock to sustain independently. But the reciprocal part of that is that you don't sell, because selling out of your herd is a sign of poverty. So Nancy's first challenge was, how the hell do I get supply in a country where there is a 100-year-long tradition of not supplying? Now, even if she could overcome that, how do you build a business depending on suppliers from nomadic people who are moving around all the time? What kind of logistics system do you put up to make that happen? How do you put up an industrial enterprise in a country with no finance, no access to finance, no roads, no legitimate infrastructure, no rules, regulation, competitive environment, and more importantly, in this particular country, there wasn't even any regulation for the quality of dairy products, which is, of course, extremely sensitive. Now, this lady faced, in my opinion, I come from an oil-rich country called Norway, and we are extremely proud of our oil platforms. We have huge oil technology, and we can drill anywhere. I would say that Nancy's problems, the barriers to entry for Nancy, in my opinion, was far more challenging than the challenges of setting up a huge oil platform in the North Sea. And what she did was an unbelievable story, which I don't have the time to go through in detail with you, but it was an extremely inventive story. She set up her own NGO. She created her own currency in order to have the herders use her currency to go and buy the things they needed. A very innovative and inventive story. She now has a business with 200 people employed by her, giving livelihood to 2,000 Mauritanians. She has 1,000 suppliers, people who were proud, independent people who never sold anything, who are now even more proud and more happy people who used to use a currency. And they are giving livelihood to 20,000 Mauritanians. She is improving the trade balance of Mauritania because she has stopped import from Europe. And when I normally have been around in the world speaking this speech, I have always concluded with her next challenge. And that is, now she wants to export her camel cheese, called, branded Camel Bear, to the best cheese shops in New York and Paris. And every time I do this, like you do, the audience start laughing. All right? And then my always provocative question would be, now you've heard about Nancy, do you think she'll be successful? Anybody takes a bet? Anyone ready to take a bet? Well, then people always became a little more uncertain, of course. I can't do this anymore, this part of the speech, because on March 18, 2008, I came to the office at the UN in the morning, and one of my colleagues came running in with New York Times and said, guys, you won't believe this, look at this. And believe it or not, Nancy Abaidu-Rahman's Camel Bear was to be found at the best cheese shops in New York City. Now, she's a 60-year-old woman who came from nothing and who now suddenly is taking on the Upper East Side of New York City. You know, that's quite a ride, huh? At the same time, she's creating enormous wealth to her society. So I just thought I'd give you this flavor because my whole speech really fundamentally is all about these kind of stories. In this context, we need to discuss the notion of CSR a little bit in a structured context, because here you can see a little chart with three dimensions. And let's talk to this chart from left to the right. And very briefly, I would say that if you go 60 years back in history, even Western nations, at least European colonial nations, like the UK, France, Germany, and others, sorry, not so much Germany, but Portugal and Spain, Holland, were not very well considered in most of the developing world. And the reason, of course, is pretty obvious. They were exploiting these countries for many, many years and not really doing good in many developing countries. Today, however, all of the same nations are considered by the same earlier colonialized nation, the developing world as we know it, as extremely important players to help people out of poverty. So nations could change in the course of 50, 60 years, And obviously the private sector, if the nations can change, the private sector can change as well. And this is an important perspective when you look at this chart, because if you look historically at this, the notion of the private sector in development was really a notion about philanthropy. The private sector companies in the north, and I'm not talking now companies in the south or in the developing world, I'm talking our Western world. Companies in the north, we would say, well, development, that's something for our government and multilateral and bilateral organizations to fix. We can't, you guys got to fix it, but we will chip in. We are ready to, use our surplus, our profits, and chip in on a regular basis in order to, as being a socially responsible enterprise. Now, philanthropy, however, have a couple of real. First of all, philanthropy is good. Let me say that right away. Philanthropy is certainly better than nothing. But from a development perspective, there are some big inhibitors with philanthropy. And that is, first of all, related to the fact that development is a very long-term task. If you go on looking at sexual molestation of children in Mauritania, in Ethiopia, that's not a project that you just do for a year. You got to influence communities over 25 years in order to make anything happen in this context. That's very normal in development. So the problem with philanthropy is, first of all, the problem with every gift. There is no strings attached. A company who is philanthropic doesn't invest its brand name, its reputation, its people. It's simply a gift. And as we all know, a gift is a wonderful thing to give away for free when you can. But next year, when you don't make any more money or your profits are being destructed, maybe you can't give the gift anymore. In short, you can't plan on philanthropy. With a few exceptions. But generally speaking, philanthropic gifts are hard to use as a planning tool in development. Secondly, as I said, since the risks attached from a giver perspective is very low, because you don't invest your brand value, you don't invest anything but a gift. There's also possible, the propensity you have without taking a risk to go away is quite high. So you can't really trust a partner which doesn't take a risk. So the development benefit is fairly low. The risk, the business risk is fairly low. And the business benefit from the company perspective is highly questionable. I would say the only potential business benefit of a philanthropic gift is that if you give money to save the children, for example, you can motivate your employees around some kind of common cause. This year our Christmas gift goes to Save the Children, and we are having a lecture from the head of Save the Children. There is some feel-good feeling among employees, which is probably the only benefit you can get out of it as a business. So philanthropy is, frankly, as you have heard, a fairly ineffective tool in development, both from a business perspective and from a development perspective. Then comes the next game in town, which is CSR. And CSR have some tremendous benefits over philanthropy. And let's take them one by one. First, any company who has a serious CSR strategy have to make an investment of its own time, talent, assets, people, and the associated business risk associated with it. In fact, it's a branded investment if you take a CSR investment. That's good. Because any CSR project that the company puts afloat has to be a long-term investment. It's a consideration of business associated objectives. So certainly, from a development perspective, we prefer that. Because then we are getting the best out of the best asset classes out of a company, which is not money, but frankly, people, talent, logistics, whatever the company is doing. So the development benefits are higher. Point one, because it's better assets to use. Point two, it's more long-term. No company would deploy core assets like this in a very short period of time. So it's more aligned with the long-term perspective of development. And of course, we as developers also love the fact that any company in the CSR project take a business risk by putting his reputation on the line. That's a good thing. More interestingly, as the development benefit is higher, so is also the business benefit. You guys know a lot of CSR programs, and I will not go into it today, but clearly, as I have laid out the business benefits of philanthropy, I'm sure you easily can agree that most of the CSR projects you know have a higher business benefit than philanthropy. However, as we speak, and the report that I will not show you, of course, but which you can pick up at our website at the UNDP, really is a story which tells that we are embarking upon a next step in the ladder of business and development benefits. And those are the business models of inclusive business models. It's really core business. What do I mean by core business? Well, most people who work in the CSR department would say this is core business. No, it's not. A CSR project is, by its definition, like the HR department or like the financial department or like any important department, it's a support department to what we call the core value chain of a company. What is the core value chain of a company? That is, if you take, let's take a car manufacturer. It's raw materials coming in, so it's a big purchasing department, a big outfit to regulate and negotiate and store and stock all kind of raw materials. It's manufacturing, it's marketing, and it's sales. Those are the core business value chain functions inside the company. Now, the problem with this, when I as a developer work with the company, and I work with a lot of companies in the UN, is that when people come with their CSR department, that's kind of good. But I'm even more impressed if they come with their business departments. If a division head of Microsoft comes to me instead of their CSR guy, I'm really interested. Because if a business director comes, I know that he, by definition, represents the core value chain of the company. Now, why is that an advantage? Well, let's talk about the risk. Any company who are willing to take the risk of not only putting up, some soft money in a CSR program, but actually our core business value chain on the line. For a program like this, that's a risk I would like to be associated with as a developer, right? Secondly, the development benefit is tremendously much higher if we can deploy all the assets of a company. And in particular, if we can do it, if the company does it for its own good. And that is what these projects are all about. Let's take the most typical example. One industry which has nearly by its definition a so-called inclusive business model, without thinking about it, can you imagine which industry that is? It's really two huge global industries which are inclusive nearly by its nature. Which can it be? Any guess? I'll help you. It's telecom and finance. Both of them are digitized industries. It's zero and ones, so it's no hard products. And telco is particularly interesting for my example, because when we work with a telco in an inclusive business model, frankly, the telco doesn't even think about the fact that it's working in a CSR or pro-poor context at all. They're just doing what they're doing in order to make money. But it so happens that their business models are so compellingly pro-poor that they are the most fortunate guys in the world, in my opinion. That's one of the few companies I'd like to run, an international cell phone operator. That's a fantastic business to run because, as I said, these days it's by definition an inclusive business model. Read my report and you'll understand why I'm saying that. Potentially the same with microcredit. So the point is, there is a new thing going on right now in the world, which has been going on for some years, but which some key players are now looking very closely at, and UNDP is one of them. Academia is others, and also business are. CSR is still very good, but frankly, we are moving into core business models. Companies deploying their business objectives, creating new markets, building market shares, making a profit, and doing that in a way which are inclusive, i.e. which includes the poor, either as a consumer, a supplier, a business partner, a franchisee, one way or the other. And as I said earlier, some businesses are by its nature very pro-poor. Other businesses are not by its nature as pro-poor, but this is the way the world is going. I'm already realizing that this will be late, so I will now have to think through what I'm going to tell you. I'll skip this initiative. You can read this yourself. The only thing I'd like to show you in a moment is that our study, which is the basis for some of the hypotheses and our conclusions here, are 50 new studies we've developed ourselves, but we also worked with another 400 studies which have been out there among our colleagues in this coalition called the Growing Inclusive Market. And what I think is important is that when you guys look at empirical data, you very often find data coming from a northern MNC, a multinational from our own environment, right? What we have been looking at is much rather the local companies. Our stories are much more local, much more small enterprise oriented than large enterprise. It's a multitude of industries, and it's across most continents. So it's a fairly solid base of empirical data when you put that on top of the 400 other cases we have here. Now, the net of this report really is that, as I already told you with our friend Nancy, that there are tremendous opportunities to make money and do good out there. There are tremendous opportunities for successful, inclusive business model to unfold. But if that's the case, of course, one key question that everybody would ask is, why isn't it happening more? Why do we still have 2.6 billion people excluded? Why can't we why can't we have more people participating inside these value chains? And of course, this study tells you that despite the great visions and the great opportunities, there are some huge barriers that stand in the way for this to happen at a large scale. Much more importantly, this study also demonstrates how successful companies have overcome these barriers, either by going around them or across them. And I'll take you through a couple of examples of that. Let me first define the word inclusive business models, or rather define it in a way that describes the value for business and the value for the poor. As I said, an inclusive business model can include the poor on the demand side as a client or a customer, or on the supplier side as a business partner, a colleague, employee, producer, franchise holder, an entrepreneur somewhere in the value chain, so one or more of these things. Now, the value for business in developing an inclusive business model, i.e. working with the poor, the 2.6 billion really poor out there, is on the left side of this chart, but let's spend a couple of minutes on it. Generate profits. This report tells you that the most successful businesses working inclusive, they make more profit of the really poor people in microcredit and other business areas than you make by selling the same services at the streets of New York. Now that is good and bad, and I'll come back to that. But from a business perspective, if you play these business models well, you can make more money in these strange markets than you can in your traditional markets. Point two, you are developing new markets. Now, most people will say, well, 2.6 billion people living on less than $2 a day, how can they afford my car or my toothbrush? Well, this report and other reports gives you some amazingly innovative business models to reach them. And all I can say is that the combined purchasing power of these people, do you know what that is? It's like the economy of Japan. So these people are not without cash or without ability to pay. Absolutely not. But you have to reach them in the right way with the right kind of product at the right time. the economy, a market the size of the economy of Japan. Innovation. You guys have heard about, for example, the ATM which only use fingerprints, right? You don't need to use your code. I don't know whether that product has reached America yet, but it certainly has reached rich countries in Asia. Obviously, this innovation was made for Africa and poor Asia because people don't have an ID, they don't have a bank account, or they don't have ability to write their name. So they needed some other means of communicating with a box. And fingerprints was a model. And this innovation in the South has been a tremendous success if you translate that to people like ourselves. So working with the poorest people can actually give you incentives to have an extreme success in your home markets. Expanding the labor pool. One of the most fascinating parts of inclusive business models is actually the way people are including poor people in their business value chain. You know, as I'll explain to you a little bit later, one of the real inhibitors of working with the poor is, of course, lack of market information. Who are the poor? What are their needs? What are they looking for? What can they pay for? How do they pay? How do we reach them? And it's very clear that the most successful companies, they have totally embraced poor communities by totally including them in their business models, and they have had a reach into the poor environment, which you can't do unless you include people and their networks, their culture, their societies. And there are some really fascinating stories to be told out of these reports, which you can read yourself, in fact. The value for the poor, obviously, is on the right side. And here I will tell you about 3 different strategies which correspond with the 3 first bullets here, because this is important. The first is to meet basic needs. That means the needs for livelihood. I just showed you a file where I documented that, you know, there are 1 billion people without sanitation, people without clean water, etc., etc. Those are basic needs. Now, that is, of course, a market. So in order to help the poorest people satisfy their basic needs, you got to sell livelihood to the poor, right? That's what you do. You sell livelihood product to the poor in some forms and shapes and ways which makes it affordable and accessible for the poor. That's good. However, these 2 strategies are much more important. To sell toothpaste and rice to the poor is a nice and important thing to do. But the problem, as you can imagine, is if you live of $2 a day, you don't get 1 cent richer by consuming that rice or that toothpaste, right? There is no incentive for the poor to empower him or herself by buying your rice or your toothpaste. So the next strategy, it's really important, that is what we call selling productivity to the poor. What is the best example you can imagine of productivity to the poor? A cell phone or airtime. Not a cell phone. Nobody can afford a cell phone. But he can afford airtime. Airtime, just imagine when you go home tonight, guys. You guys are on your cell all the time. Imagine for a guy or a woman in Africa who never had airtime. Just imagine what kind of productivity improvement it is as a business owner or as a farmer to have access to a cell phone. I won't lay it out for you, but it's unbelievable. It's mind-boggling. So what if you have to sell to the poor, you really don't want to sell rice. You want to sell airtime. You want to sell productivity, not consumption. However, the ultimate strategy of working with the poor is, of course, to buy from the poor, right? Not sell to the poor. Not sell rice, not sell productivity. The ultimate target is to include the poor as a supplier to the world, which is, of course, a very controversial statement if you take it broadly politically. But if you take it locally and business-wise, it's an extremely important way. And this report demonstrates a lot of business models where you include and where you actually buy from the poor, to make a long story short. So I will just very briefly go through the barriers and then the solutions, and I'll stop there because we don't have time to go through more, I think. The reason why these successful stories that you have heard about and can read about are not happening at a broad scale are because, in our opinion, these 5 different barriers. We already discussed the first one, market information. Who are the poor? What are their needs? What are they willing to pay for? How do you reach them? Second huge obstacle is, of course, regulatory environment. Very many developing countries do not have the kind of well-developed capacities for running a normal state, running a normal legislative arrangement between the buyer and the seller. And of course, physical infrastructure can also be a huge inhibitor. Knowledge and skills. People who can't read and write, how do you teach them some basic things in terms of being a producer? And access to financial services. And we have in our reports a number of examples of how these barriers have been real and systematic and systemic barriers for success. But fortunately, our stories also demonstrate that there are ways to overcome these barriers, and they are extremely innovative and extremely inventive and some tremendously encouraging success stories, really driven by individuals, by entrepreneurs, by smart people working together, whether it's government, civil servant working together with an NGO and a business owner. There are some extremely sweet and warming and innovative stories about people working together whom you wouldn't have thought would be working together in order to overcome a barrier, because the incentives for everyone has been high. And I think really, instead of, you can read this in your report, but I would say there is one very classical strategy has been to adapt products and business processes. Here, of course, technology comes to play. There are a number of examples, particularly in mobile cell phones, where you actually can just run around a number of the barriers by simply doing something totally different so that this barrier doesn't come to play for your business model. Other companies are investing in removing constraints. That's always a little bit tricky, because if you invest in a public good for a private purpose, there is, of course, a huge challenge in who are benefiting and who are costing it. And how do you make that play? There are some fantastic stories about how companies have combined these strategies, investing in removing obstacles, but doing it in collaboration, combine resources, so doing it together with the poor, and combine resources and capabilities with other players. Totally innovative partnerships happening because everybody really needed that bridge. So people just had to throw in different assets to make this work. Leveraging the strengths of the poor, I already discussed this very briefly, how companies who are really successful have totally left this business to their poor partners, because this is a totally different terrain, totally different psychologies, totally different cultures, totally different ways of doing business, totally different ways of accessing people, totally different ways of understanding needs and signals. So the best of these companies have just simply left it to the poor. I mentioned combining resources and capabilities, and finally engaging policy dialogue. I will not spend a lot of time on each of these. I just want to very briefly tell you that when we put all our findings together, we find that there are some patterns here, which is interesting. For example, if your key barrier is lack of market information, it seems that the most used strategy to overcome it is to work very closely with the poor, i.e. leverage the strengths of the poor. If your biggest problem is regulatory environment, it seems that there are 2 strategies that seems to be working the most, either alone or in combination, which is adapting products and processes, and or engaging in policy dialogue with governments. Same with physical infrastructure. If that's your product, you adapt. If that's your problem, you adapt your products and processes, or you combine resources and capabilities with NGOs, other companies, local communities, whatever. So that's the way this maps out, and of course I could probably speak for half an hour for each one of these points. Instead of doing that, I'll just show you one. I'll conclude, in fact, with another example, which takes another 2 minutes, and then I'll shut down here. one of the most successful companies, which is actually a large-scale company that I've seen in this industry, of course, is a cell phone operator. And that's a company called Smart on the Philippines. In 1999, only rich people in the Philippines used a cell phone and associated services. And these guys decided in 1999 that they would embrace the poor people, because most people in the Philippines are poor, and they believed there was a market and a purchasing power and an ability to service a totally new set of people. Now let's talk about the barriers that Smart were facing. How do you create a poor man's business in a country like the Philippines, in the cell phone industry? The first problem was, how do you get a subscriber when all of your potential customers, A, don't have an ID card, and B, certainly not a bank account, and C, can't write their name? Right? Well, this company made two huge innovations in this industry. The first one was I remember also in the Philippines there is a big remittances industry. Do everybody know what a remittances industry is? People who have left their home to work abroad, sending money back home, which is many countries in the south are dependent on that kind of funding. So Smart made two innovations. The first one was a bank account-free money transfer services. So you were able to technically transfer money without owning a bank account or an ID card. And the second was what you are using here in the US now as well, prepaid airtime. Okay? So you could pay $5 upfront and then get the airtime you needed. Then you don't need an ID and you don't need a bank account either, right? So those two innovations enabled them to access this market. Now the second problem they had was, well, now we have a product that we can sell. Now how do we sell this product to these millions in the Philippines who, point A, live on 7,000 islands, and point two, have an extremely limited distribution network? How do you reach these people? So what they did, there were sellers of cell phone services out there, so they built on those. But this company engaged 8,000 micro-entrepreneurs. Today there are 8,000 people in the 7,000 Philippine islands who are making a living and a big profit out of being a distributor, a franchise holder for this company in 7 years' time. And finally, they did something extremely clever. Wireless top-up. Do you know what that is? Instead of buying a new prepaid card, you could electronically transfer to top up the existing card that you already had, or chip or whatever it is that they were using down there. You know, sounds very clever, doesn't it? I mean, it didn't exist 5 years ago. And the third problem they had was that they were suddenly now realizing that, we are successful. I mean, they now have 24 million subscribers. It's bigger than most US operators. Hugely successful, more profitable than anyone in the US, of course. And of course, since they were redefining the industry, they also had to redefine the rules and regulations in the Philippines for this kind of thing. So they had a number of very impressive processes going alone, standalone with the government, but also together with banks and all the players who were all very supportive. So all I'm trying to tell you is, as a concluding note, is that the Smart story is another successful story, and the net of this report that we have put together at the UNDP is not really so much about the report. It's really much more about the framework of looking at inclusive business models and working with core business. And although CSR is a very important contribution, the same way philanthropy is a very important contribution to development, I think there is a general feeling in academic circles and certainly in the development circles that time has now come to take business even more serious than that, and really look at how we can use the energy of business doing good for themselves and try to influence the quest for new markets, market shares, growth and profit, as this report does, tune those quests together with the needs of the poor people and the vision of a developed society. Because the truth is, as we have seen 100 times through history, nothing succeeds like a company who have a vision in line with its private enterprise objectives. That is ultimately the way you can make things happen quickest and best. Frankly, that's a capitalist view, but I think history shows that there is a compelling argument for saying that engaging business on business terms is a very important partner in development. And I think that's the endeavor of this report, and I hope that this little speech to you tonight have given you some perspectives on this. You can visit our website, which I'll just show you in the end here. www.growinginclusivemarkets.org, and you'll find everything I've talked about, tons of good case studies, tons of experts from the north and the south who are collaborating with us, and people who are ready to talk and willing to work on these subjects. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Please. Which country are you from?
From Boston. I know the question possible, but is there? Did you find anything?
Yes, it's very clear that a country like your country, for example, is a country which today would be extremely unproven for a serious effort by the private sector to work. And so the same goes with Iraq. We have huge programs in Iraq. And I'll be frank with you, I would say even in countries who are not in conflict or even long beyond post-conflict, there are huge challenges in having governments really focusing on putting, reasonable risk-reducing measures, capacities in place to make things work. And I'll be very frank with you. I would say the likelihood that this is going to happen in Afghanistan or Iraq and a number of other countries who are in conflict or post-conflict in the short term is not there. When that is said, I will tell you that I don't think the international communities are working much in Afghanistan on the private sector. It's not much work going on in Afghanistan on the private sector. But in Iraq there is. In Iraq, quite interesting, there are today billions of dollars being put into the development of private sector activities on this kind of basis. If you ask me quite honestly, I think it's premature. I think the probability is that this money will be lost. And that I don't want that. Because what we need as a development community is that the first private funds that goes into the most risky countries are successful. Because that's the way Afghanistan and Iraq will have a sustainable private sector foreign direct investment in their country. So the most stupid thing we would do in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or some of the other countries, is to go too quickly in with high-risk money, because if that is lost, it will take another generation before private money is back, and that's exactly what we want to avoid.
Is there an interrelation in terms of success rate? Because some companies might be making more profit than others, but does that relate to the prevalence of rule of law in those societies?
Yes, it does. The more capacity for governance and business governance, the better the business prospers in the country. There is a linear correspondence.
It seems like one of the big incentives for companies to go into these poor places is the cheap labor they can find there. Do you think exploitation is a problem? And do you think it's also a problem of activists in rich countries kind of going after companies that they see to exploit people in developing countries?
I think those are two very, very good questions, and they have to be answered slightly yes, both of them. The first question is whether this motivation can be a problem sometimes, and the answer is yes. I would say most companies are operating fairly. They're operating under their CSR vision, and if you operate under a CSR vision, you don't engage in child labor, you don't engage in unhealthy medical and work facilities for your workers. So I would say more and more companies are operating solidly. But take in my own country, for example, we have a very impressive cell phone operator who is a state government-owned operator who was caught in child labor problems, not of course in their core business, but through their supplier. And any company is today responsible for its suppliers. So it is a problem, and I would say the only way to avoid those problems is for people like you to keep asking those questions, and people like me maybe also to keep monitoring that those problems go away. Yes?
In your example with Nancy and the camel cheese, was there any assessment done of environmental benefits or degradation due to her business? And I use that only as an example. If you want to expand that to other businesses, is that sort of thing studied, and what are the results if they are?
Well, I think it's a clever question, and the answer is it has definitely not been studied with her. She has been just brought to the scene, and her business model is such a wonderful story that she will be scrutinized on a number of those accounts, I'm sure, as she's now keeping her head a little bit publicly available. So the answer is no. I mean, we don't know whether there has been any environmental degradation or positive impact, or either or. I think it's a very interesting question, and maybe that business model needs to be looked at, whether or not the net impact. You can easily see that there are elements on both sides of the equation in that business model. How it works out altogether is a little unclear to me. But it's a fantastic reduction of poverty tool. All right, thanks for coming. And still more questions. Sorry.
With the recent financial crisis, have you guys seen a reversion by companies away from pro-business CS or pro-poor business CSR philanthropy, or are companies still taking the risk?
Both. The answer is yes and yes. Some companies are pulling back. I mean, there has been a dramatic situation, and everybody looks at everything they can cut back on. That includes some of these projects, and other companies are engaging full because it's a business opportunity.
Thank you. This is great. And I'm teaching a class now in which we just read The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. So it's just the timing couldn't be better for us.
Yeah, the Michigan team is a part of our coalition.
Great. Well,
Ted London, those guys.
Definitely look into a lot of your cases. Thank you so much. So there's so much happening now at the policy level in the U.S. It's almost hard to keep track, but it's certainly true that subsequent to the crash of global finance as we've known it, people are looking for new models, and that's one of the many reasons to really like what you're sharing with us, that it's a different way of viewing what business can do. So I wonder, at the sort of higher level of discussions that you're engaged in with the UN, say, and policymakers newly installed in the White House, similar creative people around the world, what are some of the policy levers that you're encouraging them to pull? An example would be a tax code that says to businesses, anything you invest in these countries, and the Bush administration has done something like this in terms of countries that aren't corrupt and so forth, we won't collect any taxes on it, any income you make. So can you share with us a little bit how that policy discussion goes and how it could expand the impact of what you're talking about?
Well, it's a very important question, obviously, and you already touched on one of the debates that are going. I would say if we turn to the developing world for a moment, the key debate is rather what I call advisory services to governments. in most developing countries, government still needs, really solid professional advice as to, what kind of capacities do they need to build, how much of those capacities, what kind of rules and regulations to govern those capacities and those institutions. It can still be, although you'll find a central bank and you'll find banks and some kind of legal functioning system in many developing countries, of course, quite successful in some places. There's still a lot of work to be done on the basics, quite frankly. Then your point was rather to sort of the incentive systems in the north. How do we in the north incent our companies to do well, but also good in the south? There are a number of discussions going on at the multilateral scene, some of them along the lines that you just mentioned. On the other hand, as you can see from this debate, I would say my feeling is that politically more and more people are driving in the direction that we are doing in this report, which is, this is now about core business. And then the question is, if this is about core business, how much incentive do you need in the north to actually do what's good for you anyway? So the truth is, I would say, the northern incentives in this philosophy is probably going down because they shouldn't be needing it, while we should work very hard on increasing the incentives in the south, or enable the south to have capacity to take up the potential increased FDI coming into that country. That's a little bit my feeling. I think certainly that's the feeling of the US government, I might say.
Just to build on that with a final question, and ask you specifically about perceptions in the international community of the Bush administration's efforts. I'm referring here to the Millennium Challenge Corporation. How was that initiative viewed in the development community? And do you interact with the UCC?
I would say I'm a little, in one way, a little bit the wrong and the right guy to ask, because at UNDP, I don't know whether you're aware of that, some of you who know this a little bit, we had, there was a huge ice front between the UN and the US, or rather because of UNDP, over the past year or so, which has sort of heated up a little bit now, of course. And that was because the US State Department claimed that UNDP had, given hard currency dollars to the North Korean government. And this was a huge ice front. And because of that, there was an awful relationship between the UN and the US, or particularly the UNDP and the US. And the US, of course, was very smart. So they decided that although we hate these guys politically, because that was the Bush administration decision, they realized that they needed to have one channel open, and who was then better than the private sector guy at the UN? And that was me. So I happened to be, a little bit the sort of in-between person between that your administration and the UN. So I know this quite well from the inside, and all I can say is that they are, of course, extremely keen on these kind of initiatives. The US State Department and your new government are extremely keen on an initiative that works pro-private sector engagement. This is clear. So was, by the way, the Bush administration. Please. Sure.
All right. So I understand the. Oh, thank you. By the way, I've never heard a lecture from a development person without talking about capacity building. Thank you. So I understand the whole pro-poor business model, but many of us, when we hear about CSR issues, it's talking about American Fortune 500 companies. Most of those companies don't have a product to sell to poor people. They have products that can use resources gained from developing countries, either natural resources or labor. But they don't have a product that can include, they don't have that inclusive business model. It's not their nature. And so they go about the CSR through philanthropy or strings attached projects, what have you. And I'm assuming you've been to Nairobi, as have I, and you drive past the strip of factories, And GM does hire more people in Nairobi than Safaricom. So you have your innovative telecom provider, and you have your traditional Fortune 500 company, pretty much side by side operating. Very different business plans, very different models, and key drivers there. But at the end of the day, for an American looking at those Fortune 500 companies and at their CSR, where does that fit in here, I guess? Zura?
Well, let me one of your faculty here just mentioned that in his class, you guys have been reading Fortunes at the Bottom of the Pyramid recently. And that's a very interesting book about all kinds of companies. But quite frankly, let me give you this. Prahalad's work, which really is the origins of what I'm talking about. So Prahalad, Ted London, Stu Hart, these guys were really, in my opinion, the early innovators of what I'm speaking about. So we all owe them something. Like all early innovators, of course you don't get it completely right the first time. Well, how could you? Now, what the problem with, the reason why you should read Fortunes at the Bottom of the Pyramid is that it talks a lot about how people in an extremely innovative way, despite the notion that, we have nothing to sell to these guys, we can't include them, how they're doing it anyway. Now, the problem with Prahalad, from my perspective, is, or the old Prahalad, he's very much into what we're doing also now, is that it was all about selling to the poor, and very much about selling livelihood goods to the poor. That's not what we really want, as I said. We need that too. I mean, there is an 800, if there are 2.6 billion excluded, there is a group of 800 of those million who really only need livelihood, all right? So they won't even use the toothbrush, but they certainly need a rice, all right? They will never be able to rise out of their poverty. But there is 1.8 billion there who, frankly, are much better off if we buy something from them or if we enable them to sell something to us, all right? And that's why the selling to the poor strategy is sort of Prahalad and company have been criticized a little bit for it. I think that's very unfair. As this work has to start somewhere, and I think Prahalad's research has been, extremely important for what we're discussing here, but it's not complete, and that's why he's criticized. But if I were you, I would read it. I mean, you can read. If you read if you read 50 pages of Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, you will get a lot out of it. All right. Any more questions?
So you obviously don't appear to be a strong supporter of it, which I totally agree with. But at the same time, you obviously do not support. From your presentation, it's pretty clear that you're not a big supporter of aid, foreign aid, which I agree with. But my question to you is, the alternative, which is often mentioned with aid, is investment. So you look at African countries right now, and you look at foreign corporations coming to Africa specifically for resources. And then someone like Dambisa Moyo, who just wrote Dead Aid, would talk about the need for increased Chinese FDI and Russian FDI in Africa. But then the problem I have with it is, if you look at it like in Katanga, in Congo, and in Rwanda, and in Angola, and in Western Africa right now, with these Chinese companies entering in these contracts and leaving as soon as commodity prices fall, how is that really a sustainable approach to long-term development in these countries if aid is proven not to be an approach?
I think that's a very relevant question. China has sort of under the cover emerged to become the by far biggest FDI player in Africa, without anybody noticing. It took sort of 5 years, and they're now far bigger than Europe and certainly bigger than the US. And you are right. I mean, we are not. I mean, the truth is, I mean, although we do business with China, obviously, we are not yet familiar with, as a society, on how these guys operate fully. They have been so short in business, quite frankly, as a nation and as companies, that we don't fully understand what a long-term Chinese strategy or long-term Chinese vision is. That worries me a lot, quite frankly.
Which a year ago was like hailing this Chinese influence and rejecting IMF loans in exchange for Chinese export-import bank loans. Now China's pulled out. Congo's screwed. Because now it goes back to IMF, now it's begging for a loan. And then IMF says, why didn't you accept our loan initially? Because, well, that's when China initially offered those as loans. But when the commodity prices fell, You look at the finding problems in the south where there's like mine after mine is being shut by Chinese investors, they just leave the country. So what I understand is how is investment FDI in that sense considered a sustainable approach to development in the long term if these companies purely apparently come in for exploitative reasons?
Well, you obviously have some experience from Congo, and I have worked in some other places and seen some of this with Chinese companies. On the other hand, I must admit, I mean, the Chinese have done fantastically well. And I mean, if we are right in our discussion here, if what we're discussing is, you know, sort of on the mark, you would imagine that, you know, smart Chinese companies, for the right or the wrong reason, would emerge at the same conclusion. To me, it sounds pretty stupid to invest for 5 or 10 years in Congo and then pull out. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I would assume it's not a long-term viable partnership strategy for a big company versus a nation. I don't know. That will be one of the key questions for the next decade, whether the Chinese are, you know, on the same playing field as we are, or if they're not. Big question.
It's always good to conclude with a big question. For us to think about as we move forward. But thank you all for coming at a very busy time of the year, and thanks to our speaker for a stimulating presentation.
Thank you.